According to Descartes, there are fundamentally two kinds of substance in the world. On the one hand, we have material substance of physical bodies, which is extended through space. And on the other, we have an immaterial thinking substance, which is not extended and is generally conceived to be simple. The problems with this view, Cartesian dualism, arise when we start to think about the interaction between mind and matter. How can it be that a simple, unextended substance of a fundamentally different kind can impinge upon and affect the behavior of physical substance, which is extended through space? One attempt at a resolution to this would be occasionalism, which says that the efficient cause of all changes in the physical world is God, and God ordains those changes to synchronize perfectly with the changes that we bring about by our own free will in our mind. So it's as though we had two perfectly synchronized clocks running, one the physical world, the other the mental world, creating the illusion that we're bringing about these changes via our free will. The mental seems to act on the physical, but actually they're just parallel tracks, kind of harmonized by God's omnipotence. So most modern physicists and philosophers don't buy into that view, and they also reject dualism outright. Some opt for a kind of neutral monism, saying that mind and matter reduce to something which is more primitive somehow than either. Information reductionalism tends towards this kind of neutral monism. On the other hand, you could go with a materialist monism, eliminative materialism, and reduce the category of mind as otios and say the only reality going on is the material process in the brain, and consciousness is a kind of illusion. It's a null category. Of course, this raises the question, to whom is consciousness an illusion? And it's very counterintuitive, and ultimately, I think, incoherent. On the other hand, we can go with idealism and say that matter is subservient to mind as a category. There's no such thing as matter that's not already within mind as the fundamental category. So this would be consciousness as fundamental. A neutral monist position can have consciousness as a particular kind of physical system, an emergent physical system. And the idea of emergence is that it is more than the sum of its parts. So consciousness can't be reduced in the fashion of eliminative materialism to its physical processes. All of those parts don't add up to the whole of consciousness. Consciousness is more than that. And this is the kind of view that Giulio Tononi takes with his integrated information theory of consciousness. This is far and away the leading theory of consciousness out there. Most people don't know about it yet, but they are able to make primitive experimental tests of this theory, which gives it a huge advantage over its competitors. It's the only testable theory of consciousness that we have. There are problems regarding the tractability of the computations involved in testing this. In very simple systems, the model of the theory can be applied and we can make predictions as to whether this system will be conscious or not. But when it comes to the complexities of the actual human brain, you have to reduce the model and simplify things. But doing that, they are already able to predict if someone is dreaming and therefore conscious of their dream, or if they're in dreamless sleep and unconscious. Hypothetically, this could be applied to people in vegetative states. Are they actually experiencing something, but they're just incapable of interacting with the world? Or, are they not? So this has actual practical application, and it is testable. So it's my favorite theory of consciousness at the moment. In general, the kind of neutral monism that I would go for in a certain way can be characterized as information reductionalism. But I would see also a value in Schopenhauer's reduction to will as a kind of neutral monism between mind and matter, saying that the ultimate substance of things is what we identify in ourselves as the will. But as far as consciousness, strictly speaking, I think that we have to preserve the integrity of our language, where we can make a distinction between a person who is conscious and unconscious. If consciousness was truly fundamental, then there'd be no such thing as an unconscious person, and we would have to be concerned about the rights of sticks and stones and things like that. So, going to the model, but first, this topic was suggested by one of the members of Pure Academy, and if you'd like to suggest a topic for a future discussion, go ahead and leave a comment below, or you can join my Discord server or pureacademy.net. The links for those latter two will be in the description. And if you want to vote in the poll for next week's topic, go ahead and click in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and a poll will come down. So go ahead and let me know what you'd like to discuss. This is the idea of Pure Academy. It's basically a discussion group in the Discord server, and on the website we share interesting articles and schedule meetings. There's also a discussion list that I generate and send out, so people have kind of like, assigned discussion partners, that sort of thing, randomly generated, but I find it's useful as a kind of impetus to get outside of your normal patterns of discussion and content consumption, and do something a little different. So anyway, with this theory, Giulio Tononi generates 5 axioms from phenomenology. So he tries to characterize what consciousness is like from within, and then he tries to convert these phenomenological axioms, which are seen as self-evident, into postulates for a physical system that would be a candidate for a conscious system. Viewed from the phenomenological side, we have existence. This is paraphrased in the Cogito, I think, therefore I am. There is an intrinsic existence of mind. We don't have to refer outside of our own mind to demonstrate to ourselves that it does in fact exist. Beyond that, there's composition, which says that phenomenology is characterized by sets of distinctions. There's left, right, up, down. Things are there or not there. There's an informative quality of consciousness. In the classic sense, information specifies the state of a system, and consciousness is likewise specified. It has a particular state of consciousness that it is in, and it's not other states. Integration. There's a kind of wholeness to the conscious experience. It is presented all at once, and each part of consciousness relates to every other part of consciousness. Exclusion. There are basically limits to consciousness. I can only see so far. I can only think about so many things. There's a particular flow of time. I don't perceive time in all of its possible representations. There's a particular flow of time, a particular grain of spatial awareness, a particular scale, all that sort of thing. And when we flip over and think about this in terms of the physical postulates, what would intrinsic existence look like for a physical system? Well, a state in a physical system has an intrinsic existence when it affects the causes of itself, the possible causes that might bring it about, and the possible effects that it might have. So it defines a causal repertoire. And when all the states in a system have this property, that when you bracket the rest of the world, each state in a system has some impact on all the other states in the system. So this is a kind of self-contained existence or intrinsic existence of the system. Composition. So as there are distinctions and a kind of mereology or part-whole relation of consciousness, a physical system will have containment of subsystems which also have a kind of intrinsic existence. So here we have he defines there's elements, which are the most primitive objects in the physical system. There are mechanisms, which have this kind of existence criteria met in that each mechanism defines a causal repertoire, right? So what that means precisely is illustrated here. So we have a state of a mechanism, and the fact that it is this state implies that the future states will be defined in terms of a probability distribution. So, if this state is X, that means the future state is 30% more likely to be Y than not, going both in the past and the future. So mechanisms have this intrinsic existence property, and mechanisms can be stacked. And so the constellation of all of these mechanisms amounts to a whole structure of consciousness, which has this factor of composition. Information. This is the kind of specification, and the information in integrated information theory is intrinsic information as opposed to extrinsic information in this kind of classical information theory sense. And the intrinsic information is, strictly speaking, this definition of the causal repertoire. So that's what it means to specify a state of a system, is to assign a probability weighting to all future possible states and past possible states. And the set of all of the causal repertoires of each individual mechanism is the causal structure, and the one variety of causal structure will be isomorphic to consciousness in the end. So that's how the specification of the conscious state takes place. The states define their causal repertoires. Integration. Now, this is really the key factor in the theory. And I'm actually going to step back. So I'm trying my best to understand this thing and explain it to you guys, but I don't understand it well enough to just fluently, off the cuff, totally, articulate it without error. But so stepping back, I didn't say anything wrong. I just kind of left something out. The way that you calculate the information in a mechanism or the whole system is a calculation of the distance between an unconstrained causal repertoire, where there's no probability weighting, or what the system would be if there was no constraint imposed by the state of any mechanism, the distance between that and its constrained state. So once we have state A of the system at time 3 or whatever, that defines a causal repertoire. We calculate the distance between that causal repertoire and the kind of null state of the unconstrained causal repertoire. And that gives a quantitative element to the information of the system. I backed up to illustrate that because the way that we calculate integration is very similar. So what you do to see integration is really that kind of emergence factor. The information of a system is integrated if you can't cut the system up and add up their causal repertoires and the information content of them. You can't cut them up without losing some information. So information is quantitative by this kind of difference between the unconstrained and constrained causal repertoires. And if I was to cut a line here in the system or exclude A and then calculate that same kind of set of information values for all the other mechanisms, if that doesn't add up to the information that we can calculate for the entire system, then the system is not integrated meaningfully. So it has to have this property that the information of the whole gives you something more than the sum of its parts. And this is calculable, and if you deny this kind of factor of emergence, then you can't really say that any kind of complex mechanism or computational system actually exists. Computers use logic gates as a way to encode various kind of logical relations. NAND gates, I think, are the way it's usually articulated. Hypothetically, you can have OR gates and AND gates, and these are kind of logical connectives that align the circuitry. Electronic circuitry was able to basically model certain simple relations in Boolean algebra, and that's how computers were able to be invented to perform logical and mathematical computations. So these sorts of systems, logic gates, wouldn't exist unless the information of the whole logic gate and the network of logic gates wasn't more than all of the brute kind of physical constituents of these systems. So that means if you divided up the logic gate, if you broke the system, suddenly it's a loss of information. I mean, if I smash the radio, I'm not getting the signal, right? The radio is an integrated system, an integrated circuit, and when you smash the integrated circuit, all of the same material parts are there, but they don't sum to what they were as an integrated system. So that's the notion of integration. And when a system is integrated, it is conscious. And that's again really the core of the theory. But again, how you calculate that is the distance between the causal repertoire of the whole and the causal repertoire of the minimum partition. So whatever makes the least difference, partitioning, cutting away some element of the system, and then adding up the separate parts, whatever the minimum change is to the system, you compare the distance between the total and that gives you this value phi, which is the value, the quantitative value of the integration of the information in the system. And then exclusion, this is the postulate that I'm just not as keen on. So, I mean, I don't perfectly comprehend the system in its mathematical detail yet, or perhaps I never will. Hopefully I do. But from what I can understand, the exclusion principle seems to be kind of arbitrary, and it's a way of maintaining parsimony. So basically what it's saying is that if we can redraw the system in a number of overlapping ways, we are going to select out of that set of overlapping possible drawings of the system, we're going to select the set which has the highest phi, which has the highest integrated information. So basically all the possible ways of drawing the system and all of the possible temporal and spatial grains over which we can draw the system, the highest phi value set wins out, kind of beats the others, and that is the actual conscious system. That's what the theory will predict to be the actual conscious experience. So like my brain produces my consciousness, but what about my brain minus this lobe in my right hemisphere or whatever? Like, couldn't that still represent a kind of integrated system? And there's ways of drawing the sets and analyzing things where you can call a subset of the whole thing an actual conscious organism, or rather consciousness. But exclusion is this added postulate which says the highest phi wins out, high phi wins out. The thing at the right spatial scale, spatial grain, and temporal scale, temporal grain, that's going to be the actual conscious one. So this that does it for the actual postulates of the system. It's all mathematicized in the theory, and it's operational, and there are still unresolved things to the whole system. There's a lot of interesting implications. So exclusion can also be misleading because it does not imply that there aren't paraconscious components going on in the brain. So we are this highest phi value main complex. The conceptual structure is what it's called. We are that, the maximally irreducible highest phi conceptual structure represents the main consciousness that our brain runs. But parallel to that, there can also be minimally conscious systems which are separate and doing separate things. And in split brain patients, when you have to sever the corpus callosum, usually this is to prevent seizures. When you do that, there's experimental evidence suggesting that split brain patients actually have two separate consciousnesses. Like if you show something to their right eye, their left hand will be able to do something that it wouldn't otherwise. It seems as though the evidence suggests there's two separate consciousnesses going on. So that would be two main complexes. But in addition to that, the theory would predict that there could be minor conscious complexes that we are not conscious of, but are in their own right to a degree conscious. And also, of course, there would be unconscious systems as well. Other interesting implications are that neurons don't actually have to be firing. They don't have to be sending a signal to produce consciousness. They only have to have the causal aptitude of affecting the system. So what it is a causal structure that consciousness is. So what you do is you map all of the causal repertoire of all of the mechanisms of the system in a high dimensional space where each axis represents different possible past and futures of the system. You plot all of the mechanisms of the total system. You plot all the mechanisms along these axes, and the constellation of these points in this high dimensional space is the maximally irreducible conceptual structure, which is consciousness. So that causal structure ultimately is what consciousness is. And it helps, I think, to account for its emergent property by saying that it is existent in this kind of higher mathematical realm as a totality. Maybe you could say there's a higher dimensional space above that conceptual space where the constellation is represented by a point along yet higher axes. And this would give a kind of unitive quality. So there's a unity in a higher space, and the depictions of the relation in three-dimensional normal space would be described by a position in a yet higher space, which would allow consciousness to have this kind of unitative quality where it's all one, and yet there are differences, which kind of lends toward the view that it exists in a higher dimensional space, but the lower dimensional space is a characteristic of it. So this kind of dual participation in different spatial dimensionalities can account for some phenomenological properties of consciousness. The exclusion thing, we can have minor complexes that are conscious. I found that really interesting. Let me just think for a minute and see if there's anything else regarding the system. In principle, the conscious system is substrate independent. In the same way that logic gates are substrate independent, you can swap out the underlying circuitry and the same structure will exist. The same conceptual structure, the same mechanisms can exist regardless of the underlying hardware, which would lend itself towards my theory of reincarnation, incidentally. And also this whole notion of the causal repertoire and the conceptual structure being related to a distribution of possible futures and pasts is compatible with many worlds. It's compatible with Max Tegmark's mathematical multiverse. And it ultimately does identify consciousness as a kind of mathematical structure. So it's very parsimonious because we can eliminate this kind of mind-matter dualism. We can view it as an emergent property, and we can characterize exactly how that emergence exists at a fundamental mathematical level, how it takes place. We can predict whether this emergent property of consciousness will actually occur or not. So that is my outline of integrated information theory. There are other videos that I'd recommend you check out. I think maybe because I'm not an expert, hopefully I could explain some things in a way that might click for someone who, might not want to listen to Tononi himself, or, they can't necessarily understand the original paper. The paper will be in the description as well. If you want to read the latest version for yourself, I'd recommend at least trying to do so. But the discussion for this topic will take place on Saturday at 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 10 a.m. this Saturday. So please do join the Discord, show up for that chat. We won't necessarily get deep into integrated information theory. We can definitely explore it more, especially if some of you guys actually want to look into it for yourselves. But we will just discuss the ideas of, mind-matter dualism, neutral monism, theories of consciousness, philosophy of mind type stuff. So if you're interested in that, show up. And in any case, thank you for listening.